Dear Professor Dungeonmaster, I felt your video on 5e jumped the shark. It's the exact opposite of why I started watching your channel. I wanted games with verisimilitude, a word I learned from you. Ooh, thank you. And grit. If the takeaway is just to embrace Critical Role in a game I mechanically and thematically don't enjoy because it's ubiquitous, I am out. Well, I appreciate your SAT level vocabulary, but the subtext here is that Professor Dungeonmaster is losing his edge. He's not as gritty as he used to be. Au contraire. Today I'm wearing my +2 vest of protection, and I'm going to give you tips as to how to make your 5e game or OSR game lots more badass. Today on Dungeon Craft. Welcome to Dungeon Craft. I'm Professor Dungeonmaster. This channel is about playing the best game of D&D that you possibly can.
And I'm Deathbringer. I put the bad in badass.
First, let's talk Critical Role. I'm not a critter. I don't have time to watch other people play D&D. But I admire a couple things about them, mostly that they are enthusiastic and they're prepared to play and they take their turns quickly. Also, they don't whine, complain, and throw dice at the Game Master's face when things don't go their way. And I think that's something that every Game Master should embrace, and I'd love to have those people at my table. As for 5e, I admire the way 5e is built. I especially admire the modularity, how you can hack one section of the rules and kind of make a totally different game out of it, or at least a different feeling game, and that's what this video is about. I'm going to give you just a couple of tweaks that you can make the game a lot more dangerous and more badass. Now, the first of these tweaks won't even change the rules. I got about 3 that are totally rules neutral. I am going to work strictly within the parameter of the rules, so you don't have to change anything. And the other 2 are more radical. First, a little history. I played Advanced Dungeons & Dragons all throughout the 80s until the 2nd edition, and when the 2nd edition came out, I really didn't embrace it. I never actually bought it because to me it felt kind of vanilla, milk toast, and not dangerous. There were a lot of elements they took out, like the demons and devils, and I know people are going to say in the comments that no, they were there, they were just reskinned. I wrote for Dungeon Magazine. I tried to have a scenario where there was a demon, and I got letters back from the editor that says, no, we don't do demons and devils. It was very clear to me. And you could say they reskinned him, but I think that's bull. Asmodeus is Asmodeus. He is the Prince of Darkness and will not be reskinned. I also didn't like how they turned thieves into rogues, and I think that was pandering to concerned parents that didn't want D&D associated with any sort of criminal activity. And there are going to be people that say, no, Professor, a rogue is a criminal. Yes, I know that, and it was a big insult in the middle of the 18th and 19th century. But today, there are no connotations of criminality associated with it. I saw a Nissan Rogue the other day. It was a mom dropping off her kids at karate school. Nissan wouldn't be using the word rogue if they thought it was associated with criminality like thief. A thief is a criminal like Conan. He's a thief, a reaver, a slayer. The Nissan Rogue is what you use to drive your kids to soccer practice. So my friends and I turned our attentions to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Now, here was a game that was gritty. The cover promised a grim world, a perilous adventure. The art looked dark. The armor absorption system felt more realistic. Characters had fewer hit points. They had critical hit tables that described sinew being separated from bone and burying your axe in your opponent's skull and getting splattered with brain matter. And it was glorious. It seemed a lot darker than D&D, but 30 years down the line, I've realized it wasn't nearly as dangerous as I thought it was. For one thing, they had the mechanic of fate points. You had 3 fate points, and it was basically a get-out-of-death free card, so your character could die 4 times before they actually died. This version of Dungeons & Dragons, where you only had 3 or 4 hit points and you died at 0, is a lot more lethal than Warhammer or Advanced Dungeons & Dragons ever were. And after 15 years of playing Warhammer, we switched back to D&D because we realized we could just tweak the rules and get the same results, but in a lot less time. The Warhammer system kind of drags down once you're on your 3rd career. Now, a lot of players think that if they want grit, they have to switch to another system, like, say, Mörk Borg. And I like Mörk Borg. I gave it a good review. I love the random tables. It's got a very death metal vibe. But the characters have actually a lot of hit points until about 30, where it slows down. But I was surprised about how many hit points the characters actually have in Mörk Borg. And I could give you that same Mörk Borg feel with 5e with just a couple of changes. So here are my top 5 tweaks to make your D&D game grittier. And again, the first 3, no suggested changes to the rules here. Number 1, don't allow resting. The Dungeon Dudes have a Kickstarter called The Dungeons of Drakkenheim, in which this meteor destroys this city, and there are meteor shards that cause you to mutate. It's a lot like Mordheim for Warhammer. In the Dungeons of Drakenheim, your exposure to this radiation and the poisonous air means you can't rest. What the Dungeon Dudes have done is create a fictional reason as to why that particular mechanic should be suspended. And it's quite a brilliant move. If you say to your players at the beginning of the game, well, we're not going to do short and long rests anymore, you're liable to get a mutiny. But if you just say, oh no, the air is poisonous, so it doesn't allow you to rest, they'll probably be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So the next time your players are in the Tomb of Horrors or Tomb of Annihilation or whatever they're calling it, you could just say, well, the wailing of the souls of the deceased adventurers who preceded you make it impossible for you to rest. They'll probably go along with it. The other thing you could do to mitigate short rests is to have adventures with time limits. You don't just go into a goblin cave. You go into the goblin cave to rescue prisoners that the goblins are going to eat within the hour. You don't have the players just rescue a princess. They have to rescue a princess from cultists who are going to ritually sacrifice her in order to summon a demon in just 59 minutes, so there's no time to rest. It continues to baffle me why game masters and designers, who are generally fantasy, action movie, and sci-fi movie fans, haven't gotten that at the end of every movie is a timer with a bomb about to blow up. Timers force your players to get their ass in gear and don't allow them to rest. 2, roll all your attack dice right in front of your players. That way, they know you're not fudging. A natural 20 means the monster scores extra damage. Or you could create a monster with a legendary action. Let's call him the Lopper, and the Lopper collects the heads of his victims. And on a natural 20, he slices a character's head off. It doesn't matter how many hit points they have, they don't get a save, they are just dead. And I think it's only fair that you tell the players that the Lopper has this ability, and you give them some sort of hint, like, tons of heads decorating their den. And if you give the Lopper 2, 3, or 4 attacks, I guarantee your players will be terrified and you will have a gritty game indeed. 3, rein in your gods. There's an obscure line in the text of the cleric in the player's handbook that reads, check with your DM to see what gods are worshipped in their world. There it is, right there on page 57. It's an official rule. This means the DM can model the gods on Crom from Conan, who prizes valor in battle. And the only way to get into Valhalla is to die bravely, facing impossible odds, and Crom doesn't do healing magic. He wants characters to die so they can serve him in the afterlife, which is why Vikings were buried with armor and weapons. So healing words, cure wounds, revivify, healing spirit, and any other health-restoring spells are out the window. And if players complain, just cite Player's Handbook, page 57, paragraph 2. Sorry, rules lawyer, you've been overruled. Number 4 is pure hit dice. This comes from 5e hardcore mode. I've mentioned it before, even recently, but it's worth mentioning again. The concept is simple. You don't add constitution bonuses when rolling either creatures or characters' hit dice, and this means by mid-levels, characters will have a third less hit points, and monsters will always have a third less hit points, and that means combat will go much faster. As characters lose hit points, the tension and sense of danger increases. This is why in grittier systems like Warhammer, The Witcher, and Elric, characters have fewer hit points. The challenge is to reduce the hit points without totally imbalancing the game. This is why hardcore mode is so great. They figured out how to proportionately reduce hit points without altering monster or spell damage. And number 5, death at negative hit points and no death saves. In this version of the game, BX 1981, you died at 0 hit points. In Mörkborg, you die at negative hit points. Either way, you don't get death saves. And someone's going to say, but Professor, in first edition, you had negative hit points. Yes, and I think that was Gary Gygax's all-time worst rule. In my opinion, death saves and negative hit points are the training wheels of RPGs. They are a commercial concession aimed at younger players and less mature players who get upset that their precious characters are going to die. The designers at Wizards of the Coast want to make sure that people don't throw a hissy fit and quit the game and stop buying D&D products. So that's why they're there. And the problem is they reduce the sense of risk and danger. When I play 5e straight up, I don't get the feeling my character is going to die. I get the feeling of tub thumping. I get knocked down, but I get up again. I make the death save, I get up again. But you don't have to check out the entire 5e system. Just have death when you hit negative hit points. That's the point of this video. You don't have to get a whole new game system if you don't want. You could just hack it, import some rules from other games, and you've got a game that's just as gritty as those games. If you want more tips on how to run a grittier game, you want to check out my House Rules Deathbringer, available at Patreon, link below. They're totally compatible with 5e, OSE, and any old school rule set, and they look great with layout by Runehammer. And for more great content, check out these videos over here. May all your rolls be 20s. Hey, Deathbringer, do you believe people think I'm getting soft?
Just this morning you were singing Sailing by Christopher Cross.
Hey, that's a great song.
If you say so, at least you can look like a badass if you order my t-shirt at the link below and watch more Dungeon Craft.